Start a recording. Hello and welcome to our second, I was going to say iteration, but that is not correct. Well, welcome to the second of the Cracking the Code volunteer webinars. I am going to co-sponsored, presented by the Ohio History Service Corps, specifically Annie Talmadge, who is hosted at the Hancock County Historical Society, and co-sponsored by the Ohio Local History Alliance. And I am going to go ahead and give it to Annie right now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see I see a few names from the last one. But this morning we're going to just go back over a little bit about what we talked about last week, but then we're going to dive in a little bit more in depth in details and nitty-gritty things that aren't necessarily something you want to think about when you're just starting, but something you want to think about once you're really into it. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, Betsy, it says I cannot share my screen. There we go.
I've just made you co-host, so.
Thank you.
I just thought of that as I finished you, so.
You're good, no biggie. So, our very first thing we're going to talk about is utilization basics. This is stuff we already talked about last week, but I figured we'd go over it again just a little bit in case you weren't there or you just need a refresher. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is if you don't have something for your volunteer to work on, communicate this with them and ask them to come back another time. You don't want them to waste their time if there's nothing for them to do. This will make them feel better about volunteering because they understand that you care about their time, but it also kind of takes the pressure off of you that you don't have to kind of keep track of volunteers that don't have a job right then and there. Make sure they're comfortable in their position and don't be afraid to move them to another project if you think they will fit somewhere else better. This will come into play a little bit later on in the presentation, but just don't be afraid to move them around. Ask them what they want to do. If it seems like they're not happy in their position, just see what they want to do, see if there's something else that might fit their needs or their wants a little bit better. Use their specialized skills where you can. Please use the specialized skills. Those are really valuable tools that you can piggyback off of later on, but you want to use those skills anytime you can. Don't draw from the same well every time. This can lead to volunteer burnout. Don't ask the same couple of volunteers every time to do the same thing. Make sure you're varying up your volunteer base. I understand if you only have a couple of volunteers that may be difficult. You can always say that you're asking, but don't feel obligated to come if you can't. But just try to make sure not the same couple of people are being asked all the time. And finally, volunteers often have fantastic ideas. Don't dismiss them. I harped on that a lot last week and I'll continue harping on that now. They can bring some really cool new energies to the field and they can give you ideas that you would have never thought of and that they may see things in your institution that you don't see. So don't dismiss them and have an open mind. And appreciation basics, a simple verbal appreciation goes a long way. Just a simple thank you. We appreciate you. You mean a lot to us. Thank you for taking time to be here. That means a lot to volunteers because it shows that you care. Formal thank you notes. Everybody loves getting mail, even if it's just handing it to them, but even if you could mail it, that would be even cooler. Everybody loves those little things. It doesn't cost a lot. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it has a really big impact. A full appreciation event. This is more for those groups that have really big volunteer bases or you have a decent amount of money that you can spend on it. But this will show, this is one way to get all of your base together at one time and do one event and cover all your bases at once, essentially. But this event can show your volunteers that you care, maybe on a little bit of a higher level. But if you don't have the money or you don't have that large of a base, it's not mandatory by any means. Volunteer award ceremonies, again, this is better for those that have the really big volunteer bases. But it always feels good when a volunteer is given something or awarded for their service. You can always do pins for like 5 years of service or 100 hours of service to the organization. And promotions to volunteer leadership roles. This is going to be more beneficial for you in the long run, because if you can trust your volunteer to do a leadership role, then they can maybe take some more responsibility off of your plate. And also they can direct other volunteers that may be new to the organization, so you don't have to spend the time doing it. So kind of a twofold that makes them feel really good because you care and you want to put more into them to grow as a person and as a leader, but also it takes some time away from you that you can use that time. Keeping in mind, don't bite off more than you can chew. It is better to have a small but quality volunteer force than a large group that is not productive. Getting new volunteers is really hard, and starting a program is really hard. So start small and make sure that your volunteers are dedicated and that they care about the organization. Even if it's just 2 or 3 volunteers that come in once a week or something like that, they care about the organization and they're going to put out good work. If you try to get a lot of people at once, unless this is for a major event that you just need bodies for, trying to get too many people at once could lead to confusion and overworking of the paid or unpaid staff. It could lead to a lot of things that may make it not a great time for the new volunteers. So start small and then work your way up. The next point goes along with the appreciation. Always check in. Make yourself available to talk so they feel like they are part of the team. Without those volunteers, the organization may struggle significantly, especially if you have, if you rely on volunteers already. Always check in with them so they feel comfortable, because if you lose them, that can make it very difficult for the organization to continue running. Especially like if you have somebody in the front and they always greet people, all of a sudden they leave because they aren't being checked in on, they don't feel comfortable anymore, maybe they aren't happy with their position. So now somebody that is on unpaid or paid staff now has to fill that spot, and that's taking away from other things that the museum could be doing. Again, expect amazing work from your volunteers. They do not always have to be given easy work, and I say easy in big quotes. They can tackle massive projects and produce great results. Maybe your volunteer wants to do a really big archival project, or maybe they want to help with accessioning a new collection that you just got that is massive. They may be willing to do those really, really big things, but you also have volunteers that want to sit at the front desk and greet people and be that face of the organization. I say easy in quotes because it's not necessarily easy, but it's not something that takes as much training as like working in the archives might. And volunteers should not replace paid staff. This is something I harped on a lot in the last session. And with COVID now, that complicates things. Budgets are tighter. Trying to get people in the door is more difficult, and we all understand that. But also because of COVID, those jobs are almost more important now than they ever were. So if you at all possibly can, keep your paid staff on and don't use volunteers to replace those staff. That staff brings a different level to the organization that volunteers just simply can't. So I have a question for everyone, and you can put this in the chat box just as you did last week. What audiences has your organization identified as underrepresented in your volunteer base? So have you noticed that a certain age group isn't coming in? Have you noticed that you aren't reaching a population that you know is present in your community, but they aren't coming into your museum to volunteer? Feel free to drop that in the chat if you have any answers. So Leslie says, college students looking for experience. Yes, that is a question I've gotten a lot throughout my service. Young people, it's really hard to get young people in the door. And more young people are popping up on the chat box. Young people are really busy. If they're in high school, they're trying to balance sports, clubs, honor societies, getting ready for college, trade school, or whatever their next step is, and school, and potentially family, household work, and stuff like that. They're really busy. Young professionals who may be just starting a family, or they're very driven in their career, they're more career focused. So they're spending a lot of time at the office, or they're trying to start a family and do all that too while also still working. So there's not as much time for young people to spend their time volunteering as there is for, say, retired folks. They can definitely work it in. I've worked it in, lots of people work it in, but you have to make it something that they want to go do. Otherwise, they're not going to do it, and there's other things for them to go do. So we'll talk about some recruitment strategies as we go through this, but I am glad to see that most people are on the same page for the young. Okay, so Ronald says that they have a Hispanic population that is not really represented in their volunteer and board bases. Yeah, that's a really important point to make too. What kind of ethnic diversity do you have in your organization? That's part of your community, and that's something that needs to be addressed as well. It may be kind of scary to do that, but I think it's really important to reach out to those communities and say, hey, come on in. We want to work with you. Please volunteer with us. Give us ideas. We want to hear from you as well. Okay, so reaching new audiences. Understand who you have reached. Do you mostly have older retired teachers? That's usually what we have at our museum. That's what a lot of museums have. Because they're already kind of in that education sphere, they generally just gravitate to museums. So knowing who you have reached is important. Look at your community to understand who is not being served. As Ronald said, the Hispanic community is not being served in their area. Young people are not necessarily being served. Make sure to have events that meet different needs. No fee, children-centered, adult-centered, open house. Make sure you're having so many different events. Have those dinner parties that are $75 a plate, but also have those open houses that may be $1 to go in or nothing at all. So everybody in the community has a chance to participate. Have things on weekends, have things in evenings when the parents may not be working and they can bring their children. Have only adult content, have canning classes or something like that. So maybe the adults can have a break from their children at home. Open houses are a really great way to do this. Nobody feels obligated to stay for a certain amount of time. They don't have to pay anything, but they get to meet the people at the museum. They get to see the museum. And that can bring them into being more interested in volunteering later on. Don't be afraid to get creative. The Hancock Historical Museum, where I'm based at, we have a lot of events and a lot of different kinds of events. And it has forced me to get creative as well. So just brainstorm, look up what other nonprofits are doing in your area. Look to see maybe what those communities that are not being reached, what are their nonprofits doing that serve them more. Just sit around and talk about at your board meetings and see what people come up with. It's kind of like throwing noodles at a wall and seeing what sticks. Sometimes you'll have things that fail, but more often than not, you might have some really cool new things that come out of this. And digital content is very important, especially right now. There is kind of an overload right now of digital content because everybody's transitioning to that. But that is the primary way you are going to reach your groups. Anybody. And it's potentially easier for other groups to reach your content if it's digital. But right now, most people aren't going into museums if your museum is even open right now. So try to get a Facebook page going and try to do like a weekly post. Like we do on Wednesdays, we wear pink and we have a pink piece of clothing that we highlight from the collection. Things like that to get the audience engaged. Trivia Tuesdays. You could do a recipe week or things like that to try to get people to interact with the content, but not necessarily having to go out of their comfort zone and go to the museum if they don't feel comfortable right now during COVID. Recruitment methods. It's a long list, I know, but there's a lot of ideas here. Use social media. As I said, digital content, really important, right? Highlight volunteer stories or put the word out about big events. Use your Facebook page. You know, if you have enough volunteers that you can do like once a month, this is Susan and she does X, Y, and Z, and she's been working with us for this many years. We really appreciate her. Highlighting volunteers will show the public that you care about your volunteers. So then they'll go, oh, that sounds cool. Maybe I want to go do that. And using social media will also help put the word out about your big events or any events at all. Most people will look through your Facebook page to see what you have going on. And then if people can share the event, friends of friends of friends may see these things that normally wouldn't see them. Have a volunteer sign up at an open house. As I said, open houses are really powerful tools. They bring in more people in the community than if it was a paid event or a specific type of event that's geared towards a certain group. But have a volunteer sign up there. They may at the time feel really engaged and want to participate in your museum, so use that captive audience. If you have a website, and I'm very aware not everybody does, and I understand websites are difficult, put up a sign-up form. If somebody's just Googling your museum and the website comes up, there could be a sign-up form right on the top that they can sign up for to be a volunteer. And then that way you have their information and you can start them through the process of becoming a volunteer without them necessarily having to come in, which is important right now. Word of mouth is really powerful as well. That's how we get most of our volunteers here. So if you start off with a couple of really good volunteers, ask them, do you have some friends that would be interested? Have you met anybody that seems like they'd be interested? That kind of thing. Get them to put the word out to bring people into your organization. You could broadcast on radio or TV. We do, I think it's monthly. We do a radio broadcast and we just talk about our programming for the month or the next couple of months. We talk about what's going on at the museum. So it's still reaching different audiences. You have the social media that reaches one type of audience member. You have radio that reaches a different type of audience member. So you're trying to hit as many different groups as you possibly can. You can also ask the local paper if they would like to do a story or if you could write a guest column. If you have events, invite the paper. Have them come and take pictures and do a story and get your organization out there in print. Because a lot of people, contrary to popular belief, still do get the paper. So they can see your organization. They may have never even heard of you, but if they see that you did an event and they see that in the paper, they may get more engaged. Reach out to groups like National Honor Society or scouting groups. This is for, at least in this context, for younger people. Those kids that aren't needing hours for their honor societies. I know you need a certain amount to graduate sometimes. Scouting groups, 4-H groups, anything like that, they all usually have a requirement for community engagement hours. So feel free to reach out to them and say, hey, we have a landscaping project that needs done, or we want somebody to go through a certain collection. Would your group be interested? And they can put you into contact with people who share similar, ideas and that they like similar things. They may have some really great history buff kids that wouldn't normally come into contact with the museum, but through this, they could come into contact and volunteer with you. And that could breed more of a going into college and getting history degrees and all that kind of stuff. That's higher thinking, of course. But these groups are really important. The youth engagement is definitely a powerful tool. And you can give presentations about organizations at meetings like Rotary or Kiwanis. This one's a little bit more difficult. It definitely will help if you have somebody that is a member of Rotary or Kiwanis or whatever other service type organization you're looking at. This is obviously geared more towards adults, but you can give a presentation on this year we did X, Y, and Z. We made progress on these projects. We're really engaging with the community by doing this other type of event, and open it up to them to see if they also want to be at least members, maybe volunteer, at least be engaged with the museum. All of these different tools reach different groups, but together they can be really helpful. So now we get to some of the icky things that we don't necessarily like to think about or talk about because they're difficult, right? Just like staff, volunteers also should have evaluations. They don't have to be a crazy sit down, closed door, multiple hour intensive evaluation. But you still want to check in with them and make sure they're doing okay and that they're doing the job they signed up to do. Tell them ahead of time, especially if the evaluation is based on in-action observation, like tour guides. It's not really fair to just all of a sudden say, oh, hey, Susan, we're gonna go have our evaluation right now. They may not be prepared for that, and it might make them nervous, you know the drill. So just definitely tell them ahead of time and prepare them, tell them what it's gonna be like. That it's not an evaluation on if we should get rid of you or anything like that, but just to make sure they're comfortable. As I said, it does not have to be as in-depth as an employee evaluation. It just ensures that both the volunteer and the museum are happy with the volunteer service and parts in the organization. You want to make sure that they're doing the job that they signed up for, and that can get kind of touchy and difficult. But if it is taking more staff time to kind of clean up after the volunteer, if they're not doing the things they're supposed to or do them correctly, that could be detrimental to the organization. So evaluations can go through and kind of help clear up some things that the volunteer may not understand, but think they understand. It definitely should consist of helpful feedback and positive reinforcement. Don't forget, they are still volunteering their time, so you don't want it to be a negative, bashing, terrible time. Make sure it's positive and it's a good thing, because they can also grow from that as well as leaders and as members of the community. If there are performance issues, provide training and assistance to help develop the skills needed for that position. They may think, yes, I know how to use past perfect and I'm doing great and I know how to de-accession this stuff and no problem. But upon evaluation, you may find that they're not doing it properly or going about it the way they're supposed to. So maybe they just need a refresher on training, and it's really easy and you're good to go and all of the problems are fixed. So just little things like that will help both the organization and the volunteer perform better and have a better time. So you also want to do program evaluations. This is on the whole volunteer program as a whole. This is important for both understanding how the program is evolving and how it's doing. You want to make sure your program is successful, but also this can be really important for grant writing. Especially with this first point I make, keep track of the numbers. Number of volunteers, hours, demographics, new volunteers. Did you get a whole bunch of new volunteers for some reason? You want to keep that in mind and you want to document that. Number of volunteers and hours especially is really important for grant writing. Especially if the grant directly relates to volunteerism, they want to know how you're keeping track of that. If nothing else, they're going to ask you to do that for the grant itself. So this can get you a leg up on understanding how to do that. Currently, 1 hour of volunteer work is worth $27.20. That's pretty cool. That's a decent size number. So that's something you want to keep in mind, that is something that a grant is also going to look at. That's something we have to keep track of for AmeriCorps, I'm sure, and lots of other nonprofit organizations. They have to keep track of this stuff. There are 3 different ways you can go about doing a program evaluation. Process-based is the program itself efficient? This is numbers in and out. You know, are you getting enough quote unquote bang for your buck with your volunteers? Is it producing what you want it to? Goal-based is the program meeting specific goals within the timeline. This may not be a numbers-based thing. You know, are you completing your archival projects within the timeline you specified? If not, that may mean you need new volunteers, more volunteers, different volunteers. With outcomes based, has the program resulted in the outcome you wanted? This is like big picture at that point. Not necessarily numbers based, not necessarily goals, but are you happy with the end result? Is this what you wanted? Did you want to have a volunteer base of 50 people by the end of, 2025? And you got that. Perfect. That outcome was good and your program was successful. So I definitely think a mixture of all three will be the most beneficial. It's kind of hard. It's difficult keeping track of all the numbers and all of that stuff. It can be confusing, but it will help you be more successful in the long run. Evaluations of the staff that work with volunteers to ensure proper supervision. Make sure the staff is also being evaluated, not only on their own performance as a staff member, but how they're working with volunteers. There may be a problem that you don't know about, and you want to make sure that that gets taken care of. You may just need to switch around which staff works with the volunteers, or maybe the staff member doesn't understand their position with the volunteer, and that just needs to be discussed more. And evaluations of the program by staff that do not work with volunteers. So if you have staff that do not work directly with volunteers, and this will be more difficult, especially in the smaller organizations, but if you have a staff member that just kind of does their own thing and only kind of comes in contact with volunteers, they may see the program from the outside looking in and may see some things that you haven't noticed. They may come up with new ideas to reach new volunteers, or they may see things that you aren't seeing, but may have some good ideas for growth. So don't forget the staff that aren't involved with the volunteers either. So we're going to take a little bit of time and do a breakout room. We did this last week as well, if you were there for us. If you were there with us. Spend a few minutes discussing with your group what kind of evaluations your organization currently uses, or any ideas that you would like to implement. So if you don't have any type of evaluation, think about what you would like to use and what you'd like to see for your organization.
All right, so if we do 2 rooms, that puts 4 people in each room, if that works.
Sounds good to me.
All right, you will shortly get an invitation, and you should go ahead and join your rooms.
Do we have everybody back, Betsy?
Breakout, it looks like we're still waiting on a couple of folks from breakout room 1. So
Okay, cool.
another 17 seconds.
Gotcha.
12 now, but this is the nature of seconds.
Constantly going.
Yeah. There we go. This should be everybody.
Okay, awesome. Did anybody have any kind of cool experiences that you want to talk about, that you discussed? Any groundbreaking new ideas, anything like that? You can unmute yourselves at this point if you would like, or you can type it in the chat, either way.
In our group, no one really had a formal evaluation program, but my concern was we do have a long-standing volunteer program with a lot of volunteers. I feel like if we were to introduce something now to say, they would be offended.
Right. Well, I can
so
totally
yeah.
understand.
So Ron suggested, just here's some new tips and tricks or something like that, or things that we can do. But I feel like if we like, we do student evaluations that are required for service hours, but I feel like if we applied that to our volunteers, they would be very offended. So
Aw,
I
I can
don't know.
understand that, especially if they've been around for a while.
Yeah, I mean, we just try to deal with things when they come up, but yeah, I would be interested to see like what kinds of forms maybe other people are using, to see if that is something we could,
Right.
if they do have programs.
I mean, I personally would go ahead and just kind of Google and see what you can see. AASLH, American Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember the rest of the acronym. A lot of those places have those blank forms, but if you don't feel like you can comfortably put that in yet, just maybe say, hey, we want to have a conversation and see how things are going. We want to try to make sure we're having the best time for both sides. Maybe they have some grievances that you aren't aware, but they don't feel like they can talk to you about them in an informal setting. And even if you're just taking down the numbers of how many volunteers you have and how many hours, that's still a type of evaluation. It may not be personal, but it's something that you're getting out there. And maybe ask those that have been there for a really long time, say, hey, how would you feel about some type of very basic informal evaluation to make sure everyone's just on the same page and having a good time? Things to just think about and try. I understand it's really hard to navigate when people have been around for a while. So. Okay, Heather posted that they do not have a evaluation system, but coming up with a handbook for them really helped them get on the same page and feel more confident when in the public. I'm really glad to hear that. That's exciting that the handbook worked out the way it's supposed to. Sometimes it doesn't. So that's like a really good step one, and kind of base your evaluations maybe off of that. But that makes me really happy to hear that your volunteers feel comfortable being in the public, which is not always true. Not everybody read it. Well, you did the best you could. You can't ask everybody to do everything, right? Does anybody else have anything before we continue on? Okay, we can continue with my presentation. So the volunteer coordinator, what's that, right? That is one person or a couple of people, but I have found it's easier when it's one person that takes care of the volunteers, that handles the volunteers as a whole. That's difficult to have one person in charge, especially if you're in a very small organization. But having a type of coordinator will make sure all of your T's are crossed and nothing falls through the cracks. So one of the first big tasks would be completing screenings like background checks or fingerprinting. This is really important, especially when working with vulnerable populations like children or the elderly. This needs to happen. I know it costs some money, but it is really important that this happens so nobody is put into a bad situation. And the volunteer coordinator would be in charge of that. They should assist with writing job descriptions as they work with the volunteers the most. This is volunteer job descriptions, by the way. So they know what each task needs to be, what each job should be. So they should be working on writing the job descriptions. Make sure all volunteers attend orientation/training. You don't want anybody to fall through the cracks and show up on their first day and have no idea what's going on. They need to support volunteers throughout their service to the institution. That could be writing the thank yous. That could be asking them how they're doing. That could be doing the evaluations, all that kind of stuff. They're kind of the support team for the volunteers. They'd be responsible for record keeping. This is the hours, how many people are part of the group, how many people are new, all that kind of stuff. And they'd make sure that the organization is showing appreciation of some kind. If you are wanting to do an appreciation event, they'd be the ones in charge of that, or at least getting the ball rolling on that. The volunteer coordinator's job is just pretty much making sure nothing falls through the cracks and making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to the way they're supposed to. Even if you have 2 or 3 people that kind of all take on that role, as long as people understand that that's their job, is working with the volunteers, I think you should be good to go. Keeping volunteers, follow the appreciation basics, give them some of the same benefits as staff members, like maybe they get a member discount. Maybe they get invited to staff meetings that are particularly important, but also understand that they don't need to be involved in all meetings, or invite them to a Christmas party or something like that. Recognition in the form of plaques mentioned in annual reports, showing yet again your appreciation that they are involved, that they are there, and simply just make them want to come back. Make sure that your site is a wholesome, welcoming site that they're excited to come to, not something that they dread. But also don't make them feel obligated to always be there if it's not something they are wanting to do. The really, really gross part, firing a volunteer. Unfortunately, this has to happen sometimes. We'd like it to never have to happen, but things go wrong. Some reasons that you would need to fire a volunteer are theft. They strongly oppose the mission, especially if they are in a public role and they are saying things that are the opposite of what you want your organization to be. They start conflicts with staff or visitors frequently, and you have discussed this with them, and this is still continuing on. Refusal to perform a task. Now, this is not saying, oh, I don't know how to do that, I'd rather not, but it's more of a, I won't do that just because I'm not gonna. Frequent no call and no shows. Now, caveat on all but like the theft. This is all stuff that can be talked about, especially during evaluations of what's going on. Can we put you somewhere else? Do you need help? Are you okay? Is something going on in your personal life that you need to step back from this role for a little bit to get that figured out? It's always really important to have those conversations before you just immediately move on to firing them. Nobody wants to lose volunteers, especially if you only have a handful. So definitely have an open dialogue. That's crucial. But what do you do when you get to the point where this has to happen? Kind of like firing a staff member. Do so in a private room face-to-face. Don't do it over email. Don't do it over text. Unless for some reason there is some violence that is concerned about, but that's like a completely different thing. Be concise and to the point, but not rude. Don't kind of give them room to convince you to let them stay. Because if you're to the point of you want to fire them, they probably should be fired. But don't be rude about it. They could be going through some things that are going on, but being rude never is helpful in this situation. Stay firm in your decision when they are upset. You know, you could have a volunteer that's like, cool, fine, whatever, I'm leaving. Or you could also have a volunteer that is just completely blown away and is very upset and is begging you to stay. You needed to fire them for a reason, as I said, so you need to probably go through with that. This is also making sure that you have had those conversations beforehand so they know that something's going on, and you know that you have had that conversation to make sure that it's not something that could be fixed. And be honest, but make sure your reasoning is sound and not an attack on them personally. You can't fire a volunteer just because you don't like them. You need to make sure that they are not following through with something, or they have done something completely against the mission, or they are stealing stuff. You know, there has to be a good reason for this, and you have to be honest with it, but never bring their personality or your personal feelings into that room and that firing. And yet again, as I said, this should be the last resort to communicate with your volunteer before it gets to this point. It's never fun, it's never good, but it has to happen. And COVID specific tips, right? We're in a weird time of, are we gonna have volunteers? Do we need volunteers? Are we gonna open up to have volunteers? Who knows, right? If you do decide at your organization you want to bring volunteers in, if you open back up to the public, or if you are not opening to the public, but you are still doing office hours, make sure that they feel safe. Provide masks and sanitizer. Don't guilt them into coming into the site. If they say they're not comfortable, and leave that completely open, that it is their decision if they want to come in or not. Have posted policies on mask wearing, hand sanitizer, what you want your visitors to do. If you feel like it needs to happen, you can stagger office times. So if you have multiple volunteers working in, let's say, the archives, one person comes in on Monday, one person comes in on Tuesday, one person comes in on Wednesday. So not everybody is there all at once. Obviously, this kind of can ebb and flow with what your organization is and what you're planning on doing, but just make sure they feel safe and understand that your volunteers are also probably having a difficulty coming to terms with this as well. So if they don't feel comfortable, don't make them come in. Keep in touch with them, especially if they're in a vulnerable population, or you know that they do not have much interaction with others. Even if they don't feel like they can come into the museum yet, give them a call, check in on them, see how they're doing. Especially with older volunteers who may be struggling right now, they don't get out. Make sure that they're doing okay and that they know there's someone out there that is worried about them and is caring about them. Mental health is really important right now as well. So having that check-in can make people realize that they're cared about. Try to modify projects to an online format if you can. I know that is a very difficult ask for many organizations, but maybe you need somebody to do some, I don't know, archiving of some kind. And if you don't use Past Perfect, or if you use the cloud version of Past Perfect, maybe you can do something like that. Look for anything that can be done offsite, just to try to limit the amount of people in your office space. Reach out to the populations who may be looking for a way to be involved with the community with little contact. People also now are unfortunately unemployed. So they may be looking for things to do with their time that maybe not be direct in contact with the public, but they may be looking to volunteer. So put that out there that you're looking for volunteers if you are, and if you feel comfortable having new people in the space. Continue to educate your staff and volunteers on changing mandates. You are a public institution for the most part, so follow those mandates. Follow the state mandates, and make sure you're always staying up to date with those. Regardless of personal feelings, you are still a public institution, and you want to serve all members of the community and make sure everybody still feels comfortable. And have a united front on the policies and statements made by the museum. You don't want, unfortunately, you don't want one rogue volunteer who is has a different opinion on some things than the museum does, and they are explaining their personal opinion, but making it seem like it's the museum's. You definitely want to make sure that everybody is on the same page on statements and policies and how the museum feels, and that is what it's being put out to the public, unless that person has distanced themselves from the museum. Questions and answers, hopefully. Feel free to put them in the chat box, and you can unmute yourselves if you feel like you want to. And I'm gonna stop sharing, I think. There we go.
We do have a couple in the chat box already. One from, I think, before the breakout groups, which was, Tom Hilberg was asking, would you require a volunteer to be a member?
Good question. I personally wouldn't. They may be volunteering because they don't have the money to be a member. But also being a member, I don't think has to go hand in hand with that. Now you maybe get members from volunteering that realize that this is a cool institution, but you don't want to put that as a roadblock to get people in the door.
And then Judy has a question about background checks. Let's see, if known by everyone and known in committee, do you mean committee or community, Judy? Or retired teacher, is background check necessary?
I believe with retired teachers, they already had to have background checks. So because they've already been through the public system, I wouldn't be nearly as concerned. It's more for the people that are not in those types of roles as it is, or new people to the community that nobody really knows.
Yeah, my 2 cents on this is that it has to do on some level with what you're asking them to do, right? So if you want someone to lead your 3rd grade tour, you know, unless they're a retired teacher, I'd probably go ahead and do it anyway, just on the safe side. You know, so it's, but if they're coming in for, you know, a community work day and you're going to be painting the outside of or the inside, you know, you're going to be painting some rooms in your building, it's probably not as big of a thing.
Right. I agree. I mean, it just depends on if they're working with those kids or elderly. That's the important part.
Yeah. Your vulnerable populations.
And I have a extension on that question.
Sure.
Is like a church, we have to do it because we're working with kids. We have to do it every 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Renew it.
Right.
What's the thought on that?
I personally, and I know it costs money, I would do it to be safe. You really don't want something to go wrong, and lots of things can happen in 5 years. So I definitely would try to keep them up to date as much as possible.
There's a website.
But I don't know if there's any type of regulations on that.
Yeah, we try to keep ours up to date every few years, even if they've recently retired within the last couple of years, but if they've been retired for over 5 or 6, we try to get them a background check just to have it on file and keep that up to date.
I agree with that.
I will say, and I'm putting the link in the chat box, but if so, you can, so anyone can, there is a public sex offender cert registry that anyone can search, NSOPW, which I really have no idea what NSOPW stands for, but you can put any name in that you want and just click search, and it is publicly available. So that is, I think the fingerprint check that will get you both Ohio and FBI checks do cost money and have to be done by various people. But if you just want to do a quick sex offender registry search. That is easy, quick, and easy and quick and free. So there's that as an option. But yeah, I agreed with everything Annie and both Ron is saying. Let's see, and there are a couple of folks in the chat box who are sharing that or at least I know Ron had mentioned that they give honorary memberships as a perk for volunteering, as does the Ohio History Connection. I think it's a given number of hours sort of thing.
Right.
And then Natalie's organization does not require membership, but they do get their newsletter. Volunteers get the newsletter, so they feel, yep. So yeah, or a mug or a shirt. So something based on number of hours.
Mm-hmm. Leslie here said that she has found with the under 40 crowd that for one and done projects at their organization, that's kind of the best thing. And I can understand that. They're busy people. So definitely that's a good way to approach it too. And maybe they'll come back when they're over for 40 and they have more time.
All right, we're coming up on 11:30. So unless anyone else has other questions or thoughts or contributions, pausing. Fortunately, Zoom doesn't tell me if someone's typing, which is.
I know. They should implement that.
I know. On the next update.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think
Thanks, everyone.
And have a good weekend.
Thanks, Betsy.
You're very welcome. Thank you.